Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Cybersecurity Chronicle podcast. Now, this is an interesting one that we want to point out from
Who are you?
our. Well, you know what? I'm Stanley Lee.
I'm Sean Mahoney. We're both of NetSwitch.
Yes, we've been
Everybody's
doing
used to
this for
hearing my voice.
quite some time, and now there is a particular article that we post on LinkedIn, our Cybersecurity Chronicle newsletter, on June 2nd. And this is a particular interesting one for us to talk about cyber risk beyond IT. That's what kind of we want to talk about today. And why is it interesting to me? Because it is related to a lot of people, a lot of organization outsourcing their IT and some of their cybersecurity solutions to a third party vendor.
Yeah,
And you
so
have heard us talk a lot about third party risk management, and this is why we want to use this as one of the example to talk about how IT related to cybersecurity, why we have to look at changing the narrative, changing the culture, looking at from a cyber risk governance perspective and as part of the cyber risk management. And we use cyber risk governance quite a bit. And now a lot of company solution providers, managed service provider, managed security service providers continue to using cyber risk governance or cyber risk management to sell their solution, rightfully so.
yeah.
But at the same time, is you know what? Let's dive deeper into this conversation from a technical perspective. That's why I'm here. And then Sean would talk it about from a customer's perspective. That's why we put together, these type of podcasts and knowledge information to share our insight into audience like yourself.
Yeah, so this started with a public service announcement from the FBI and talking about how attackers are starting to use legitimate security tools or legitimate tools in an organization. And they're using them to conduct vishing, video phishing, or smishing, text messaging, a lot like they've been using for the email phishing. And there's a concern from the FBI that AI is facilitating these hackers and the quality of what they're putting out to get inside your organization, get your employees to click something or disclose something that can give them access to your organization. We actually just had a customer, an employee received an email purportedly to be from the CEO early in the morning. First thing she saw was this email, sense of urgency to it. It looked like it came from him. She replied with information. Now, fortunately, as she woke up, she realized she had done the wrong thing and notified us to then start securing things. But they've got the tactics out there, and so Stanley, one of the things that we have talked about multiple times is the human factor. Your employees are typically one of your weakest links. And while organizations focus on investments on the technology side, the firewalls, making sure they're hardened, or software in EDR, uh, managed mobile device management platforms, and understanding what those are all good. But your employees are still your first line of defense. They get interacted with. They need to understand, pause, think, review. Is this legitimate? Granted, it slows them down, but they've got to do this. So one of the things is security awareness education. But ultimately, as you and I were talking about this PSA, is how does an executive know where their investments are going? Is it a good investment? How do they measure it?
And this is where things getting more complicated into our discussion. For our audience who has been involved in the security operations center and know that cybersecurity analysts are inundated with this type
Hmm.
of alerts. And one part that we have been talking about is how do we automate this type of process? Because simply the human cannot keep up with these, more clever attacks. And
Right.
now it's more used to be we can use the human analyst to look at, the some of the details in from the email addresses to identify whether this is a hack or it could be a potential hack or it's legitimate.
Right.
Now, the analysts cannot keep up with that anymore because we also talked about, at the same token about the security awareness, which is the cheapest solution in cybersecurity.
Yeah, it is.
But at the same time, with the AI comes into this equation, now the cyber criminals is taking advantage of the AI, and those type of spam mails are getting really good and is high quality
Hmm.
type of attack now, and they will continue to do it because it costs nothing to them at this point
Right.
in time, and all they need to do is just produce this type of attack, and they send it out, in large volume, and all it takes is just one user within the organization to click on that link, and then they get an alert. Hey, you know what? Our phishing attack is successfully, getting our reconnaissance. Go back into the cyber Q chain, has resulted in successful, um, click or this link and this attack, and initiating this type of attack. Now, how can we go back into triggering this in the article we talk about triggering antivirus attack or overriding these type of solution is already deploying in many organizations, thinking that the antivirus attack would able to identify these type of APT, advanced persistent threats, and then triggering the cyber criminals reconnaissance and the cyber kill chains, and then so they can continue to invest their time and resources into penetrating into this organization.
Yep.
And part of it is also, how can we continue to train these analysts to be more vigilant, but at the same time that they're overwhelmed, how can we balance this, to come up with a resolution?
Yeah. The PSA was even talking about how the hackers are using information about your employees to then go into your help desk people to give them access because they get into a conversation with the help desk people remotely or by email or by whatever method of communication you have set up, and they purport themselves to be an employee and are then granted access because of um, you know credentials that have been compromised. And so now they have access into the system and they're working with the help desk to give them other access into your network. And just the exploitation of then getting into the remote management software of your IT support and then exploiting that as well. And that's one of the things that we're talking about is some of the vulnerabilities in the remote management software that they've been able to get into.
So as an NMSP ourselves in our previous life,
Yep.
we use a lot of these type of tools, and then we hoping these type of solution can do its job. But at the end of the day, now it's come back to some of these tools are failing to
Yep.
address this issue. And Sean, you and I talk about, the efficiency and the effectiveness, the cost efficiency of these
Right.
tools when most of the organization only, utilizing 20% of it because of the talent shortage, the expertise within their organization cannot manage those solutions
Right.
to be more operational effective anymore. That's why we want to talk about it today. It's a long introductions, and because it is complex, it between ties it into the management side, how we
Right.
managing the solutions, also the day-to-day operations with these analysts when they utilizing this tool. Can these tools actually effectively helping them on their daily work, and we see this is become a failure in this, most of the solutions out there from IT to cybersecurity. Now,
Hmm.
what is the resolution? We talked about the resolutions about that. One thing that we're going to look at it is from the cost efficiency point of view. Well, we got to look at it from an risk assessment. Well, how many tools are actually being effective in our daily operation. We got to look at the processes and look at from the analyst perspective. Well, how are they using this tool? How are these attack able to successfully restart their cyber kill chain process in reconnaissance and then moving into weaponization. And these are the things that we want to discuss in more details in today's conversation, and then highlighting the key takeaways in for the executives, right? So, and this is what we refer as compliance tethering. How can we in one area that we're looking at from the GRC perspective, governance, risk, compliance, and then what is the risk appetite for the organizations to define the objective coming from their compliance and regulatory obligations and requirements, and then using that from a top down perspective. And then now you already invest, a lot of you already invest into many tools out there. How can we capturing their system data to correlate, and this is from the bottom up perspective, and correlating into the executive, the organization's compliance objective. So this is what we refer from the top down and bottom up perspective using system data. And then of course highlight a little bit about how AI can help to address these issues into metrics, into resolutions. So let's start with go back into the beginning. IT tool can become an attack vectors. And so we already laid out in the, this introduction. Well, people are already using these IT tools. They already invest money into it. We are not trying to tell them to, hey, let's change another solution. That's not the point. The point is to how can these type of solutions produce the type of data that can benefit the compliance requirements as
Well,
part of the cost efficiency.
it's also understanding what you're investing in. Is it an appropriate tool? Do
Well
you
said.
need to have this tool? Do you need a tool that is this sophisticated? You and I were working on with one customer, and they had a rather well-known security tool installed. It was one security tool they had installed. They should have had multiple layers of security, but they didn't. They thought that if they went and invested in this one tool, they'd be good to go. The problem is the director of IT didn't know how to properly configure the tool to get the benefit of what the tool was to deliver. And so here you had executives who had authorized the budget and the expenditure on this investment, and the executives had no way to understand the return on that investment because it was something they didn't understand. And so that's one of the things that you and I were talking about here is, and you've mentioned here, how do executives understand the risk mitigation or the return on the investment they've made?
And then you go back into some of the article we talk about. It's like Mark
Yeah.
and Spencer was on the same, newsletter. It's like,
Yep.
yes, we understand large company, large enterprises dump a lot of resource into this. And we are focusing on the small and mid-sized who do not have these talents, who do not
Right.
have these resources, but they still, because of how the MSP have recommended them or the IT team have recommended buying a solution. And it goes back into the point the executive have invested the dollar into this, but it's not fully utilized. And
Right.
so we just talking about, well, how can you using this solution system data to start into this conversation, to change the narrative, go back into 3 years again, ago, that you and I started talking about changing the narrative
Yeah.
and changing the culture, and go back into that is, okay, how can we be a more adaptively looking at this system data to reflect what we as an organization need today, because at the same time the compliance and regulatory keep on evolving as well. well, how can we continue to ut- utilize the existing investment to retune these solutions to try to address the efficiency and the effectiveness on this moving target. Now, this is where it comes back down into how what you're talking about, Sean, is how do you use this tool
Right.
and talk about the same customers. They eventually, it's like what they identify. We don't have the resource because they are SMB, small, mid-sized businesses, and under 250 million, which is a lot of company within that kind of
Yeah.
criteria, and they don't have the talent, and they invested money into this type of tool. Well, how can they look at the system data to start with? And that's why we develop this unity risk indicator as a data visualization tool to change that narrative to start that conversation.
Right.
And why we start pushing this out into our smaller group of people, because we know that it's touching a lot of different areas once it comes
Yeah.
to cyber risk management. Now, for
Right.
the people who like to do research, who like to do studies, we using NIST 8286, which is integrating cybersecurity and enterprise risk management as our framework. And now the narrative changed down to focusing on risk register.
Right.
Well, how do we register all these system data that the organization already invested in? Lots of company using Excel spreadsheets, right? They got a bunch of Excel spreadsheets, looking at these Excel spreadsheets and try to identify. Great that you are doing the right thing, but what we trying to improve on that is how do we make that correlations contextually that it
Right.
relates to your compliance and regulatory efforts.
Right. It doesn't matter whether you need to meet your state's data privacy laws or your industry's cybersecurity guidelines or frameworks, or if you're an industry that's highly regulated, the regulations you have to comply with, and then we get into global.
Right.
So
And then we touched on, again, I think this is going to be the last time I'm going to talk about history because, the industry has evolved so fast. But it is good to know about the security awareness education is still the cheapest way to enhance your cyber resilience, because it go back into that phishing attack, the
right,
email this lady has clicked on or replied. Well, how do you address it from that point? There's no system data to capture this human errors, which is what 85% of
yeah, at
the
least,
attack is starting from the human errors. So education is still going back as the cheapest way for any organization, big or small, to engage this type of conversation. But what is the resolution out of that? Is one for us is how do you engage this conversation? We using our interns as a best way to start educating about cyber risk management,
right,
and a lot to do when they just before they graduate or they just graduate, even with the degree on cybersecurity, they are still, from the practical point of view, they really don't know how to engage this conversation. Even though they wanted to help, they try to help, but what is the objective? Is it just purely technical, looking at the alerts, evaluating from the alert perspective, and to address this problem and come back with the resolution? No, it's not that simple, because that it just go into the bucket of positive, negative, and
right,
false positive.
right,
It
right,
doesn't mean anything into the organization, to the business executive. And this is a conversation that we start talking about. Well, the contextual correlation is important, but from the entry level perspective, which now you're paying upwards of 70,000 to 100,000 to engage these human capital, but they are not correlating their objective, their daily operations, the daily work, into the corporate objective. So a lot of times that it takes on into a different path. So from an educational perspective, we highly recommend, and I talk about it just like, teaching, my children when they were like 2 year old. They might not understand what you're talking about at this point in time about business objective. But if we don't start, they will never learn. Now, from a 2 year old, they sponge it. They might not make able to make any correlation or action related to it. Well, by the way, I'm not saying that the undergrad or these people are like 2 year olds. So don't get me wrong. I'm just putting
That's
as an
exactly what I was
analogy.
understanding you to
I
say.
know that you're giggling about it, but sorry if I offended anybody here. I don't mean to do that, but it's just an analogy to to bring it down into a level for a lot of people that who understand. Or like training your puppy, right? You're training your puppy is a simple thing. You got to repeat. You got to repeat, and then they might not understanding in the beginning, but as the more if you provide as an organization and business executive, if you provide an environment where you promoting learning is one of the key criteria to change the culture, then these type of education will sink in really fast. But has to start from the broad level, from the executive level, and having a brown bag lunch, it doesn't cost my company a whole lot of money, even though we're a small company, but it doesn't cost a whole lot. But during this brown bag lunch, I bet you these entry level employee, doesn't matter what they're IT or accounting or finance, it is across the board that they would appreciate this type of conversation. And then these initiatives coming from the executive, and they will look at their daily operation differently. They will look at that email differently. And along with this, a lot of the different level, we put it together, the three different level of educational program: automated, semi-automated, with management involved to give the
Mhm.
feedback to the employee, to the higher level coming from the policy perspective. These three levels of educational awareness program, that it fits into the budget, it fits into the narrative and the compliance and regulatory objective, then they start getting more effective result. And as I said, again, it's to each employee, it's just like a cost of a cup of coffee coming from this automated. And then from the data, then we can change the narrative itself.
It you're right, it's about changing, again, we're gonna say it again, changing the culture, building a culture of security and security awareness. It's important for any executive to be able to build that sort of culture within their organization. You do it already for the organization, all the employees to understand what are the business objectives? Why are we in business? What are we trying to attain? What's our outcome gonna be? You're doing that already. Now you're adding in the concept of security and starting to build that security culture that everybody should be aware that someone's trying to hurt the group, the community of
Hey,
your organization.
Sean, let's bring in your customer experience. You were
Which
a
one do you want to talk about?
well, let me just put in the framework. So tied into our third bullet point on the key takeaway, the vendors and MSP are in direct risk, right? So
Yeah.
let's talk about that. So when you were NetSwitch customers, you spent that journey with 16 years with us,
Yep.
and I told you, hey, as your MSP, Sean, you need to be aware of this. You need to start planning and putting some budget aside to focusing on. You can't just rely on
See,
antivirus when
see,
your
this is
team.
where I started to build empathy with your 2-year-olds, the lecturing that came from you about this subject. But you're right. In my previous life, I experienced indirect risks or direct risks from 3 different areas. Employee doing something they shouldn't have done, brought it home, infected the network. A vendor who sent a legitimate email and malicious encryption came on it and started locking down our networks. And then a customer sent in, because their systems were corrupted, sent in a document, a purchase order to our organization. Customer service had to open it. They opened all the emails from customers. So here, all three, a vendor, a customer, an employee, all brought in risks to our organization. And fortunately, NetSwitch had the right things in place to deal with those and remediate the situation at least on the second and third time, because we learned lessons from the first time where I had certainly ignored what you were preaching to me as far as security, and that was a fairly costly lesson for our organization. And then you guys, NetSuite, started putting things in place to keep that from happening again. But it was something that I couldn't fully understand or appreciate the costs, the impact costs to our organization ahead of time. And
Well,
it takes
I mean,
it
that
took
was
getting
in
hit in the
very
head.
early. Yeah, that
It
was
was
very
very early on.
early. Yeah, it was very early stage. And let's drill down on the cost perspective, right? So yes, of course, that I still remember that conversation. Hey, you need to prepare this server when cloud wasn't even
Yeah.
as a discussion at that point. Hey, you need to spend 25,000 to improve the server environment, to improve the network environment,
Let me sell
and
one of my kids to pay for that.
exactly. And it's like, yeah, I understand. These are the things that I say, okay, yes, it's like it was a lot of money, and it still is for some of the organizations, especially when we're trying to help the nonprofit. They don't have that 25,000. They might
Right.
not even have 2,500 in that perspective, even in today's term. That let's talk about that a little bit more and dive
Sure.
into it. Now we presented the proposal.
Hmm.
It at least it brought up your management team perspective. Oh, we now we understand. Okay, even after the first attack, but it still doesn't make any inference to the entire organization. How did they work on the budget side? Because nobody can see the potential cost of impact from any
Right.
cyber attack. All you saw was just, yes, it impacted my production environment. Yes, you know what? We charge you X, Y, Z dollars to recover from that perspective.
Hmm.
It was still much less than 2,500. I still remember that our team worked around the clock to recover the
It
data,
was like $25 million.
yeah, I wish I wouldn't be talking to you if
That's
that's
certainly
the
what it
case.
felt like. That's what it
Yes,
felt
but
like at
you're
the
right.
time.
You're right. You're right. It was a lot of money. It was still a lot of money, but you still have to pay it because the price, whether you don't pay it, which is like the ransomware we're talking about today, a lot of organization got hit. Well, shall we pay or shall we not pay? Right? So these are the
Yeah.
things that now, of course, the price of ransomware is start to increase
Yep.
because the Bitcoin is start going up as well, right? The cost of
Yeah.
the Bitcoin. So at the same
Yeah.
time,
Our
from
first
your
incident was
perspective,
malware, and so it disrupted our organization. And while the cost to recover was there, and as you said, you either pay for it in advance or you pay for it after the fact. We paid for it after the fact. But the downstream cost to the organization, employees having to show up for work and not doing anything, orders not being filled, customers being lost, orders being canceled, those trickle down costs were very expensive compared to the cost of cleanup that your team was doing at the time. But really, it was it's one of the things we've worked on and we've talked about here is the Unity Risk Indicator is understanding those risks ahead of time, bringing visibility as to what those are, and if they're not addressed, what the potential costs are from a risk register standpoint.
okay, so now let's move on to the next episode when you get, from your vendor. That's I think it was a spam email that I don't remember, but you touched on three different scenarios, right?
Right.
So let's move on to the second scenario. Now that you understand the in potential impact cost,
Yep.
and then now why didn't you feel comfortable spending or prepare that budget to improve your infrastructure? Let's talk about the elephant in the room. It's like, yes, cost is always the case, right? So now that you have the first episode, but a lot of times that where I see from a vendor perspective is looking at, well, a lot of my customers, yes, they know it hurts. It's just like the 2-year old, you slap their hands, oh, that hurts. Now I'm not going to touch the fire anymore. Or you get stung by the fire, but I'm going to
Well,
continue to push the envelope. That's how I look at it. Organization keep on trying to push the envelope. even though they are now aware of the risk and aware of the potential cost or impact into the organization,
Right.
let's now push to the envelope. Well, because I don't want to spend that 25,000, and now the price might change because of all of that. But
And
still, I don't want to invest.
yeah, and some of the investment was there, it was sort of reallocated to do certain things to make our organization more secure. But at the end of the day, we weren't looking at a third party risk. The vendor email coming in, it was a legitimate email, it was one we get all every day, but malicious stuff was coming in because we didn't fully understand what their security practices were.
Right. And
And
this
we
is
weren't
where a
asking those
lot of the
questions.
technical start, what I feel as the vendor, the technical part of it is now getting the conversation very muddy. And even though I
Mm,
learned from my experience, it's like, oh, Sean, you know what? Now to address this potential risk, now that we know it's called potential risk, now we need this XYZ solution, or several of these XYZ
yeah.
solutions to resolve them. And to you, you were not a technical executive. Now you are, after we spend years together on this, and you didn't appreciate it. I rightfully so. And I think hindsight is always 2020, right? So now we say, okay, you know what? I'm getting sick and tired of talking to you, Sean. No matter how many proposal I put together, you still don't get it. Now, all right, now I understand, it's like I'm talking to a wall, but from your perspective, now I learn from your perspective as our client, that hey, this is a cybersecurity black hole. I keep on spending money into it, but
Yeah.
what exactly is the result? We don't know. Okay, now we're going to move on to the third episode, because I don't want to bore our audience to death with our experience. Now it comes into the third episode. Now that you have a federal regulated environment as a third party, what did you do with the tech zone? I forgot what the term is.
The foreign trade zone.
There you go, foreign trade zone. Now that it was the conversation of cyber risk management is getting intense, because
Hmm.
now you are obligated
And our
to this.
customers.
Yes, to your
Yep.
customers and the federal regulators, to protecting, simply said, the data, right?
Yep.
The data privacy issues comes in. The compliance, the GRC now is really highlighting into your
Right.
organization into, well, not only that you get potentially impacting your operation and costs, time and resources. Now you potentially might get fined, you might get regulation penalty.
Right.
And now within the last, what, 5, 10 years, 8 years, since I keep calling SolarWind attack was the pivoting point to our industry, because
Yeah.
now with that, it impacted 18,000 and counting, with all this financial penalties to SolarWind, including personal liable
Hmm.
into the SEC regulatory. Oh, now
Right.
it becomes very personalized. And I think now you, at that point, you got out early in that stage, right? And this is where you start looking at the nest switch value, right? Now you can see that third party risk management, the GRC. It ties into our conversation today in IT and cybersecurity from a technical perspective. So share
Yeah.
with us, what do you think at that point?
Looking back at where I was and what I was doing, I just didn't have the ability to understand the risk in a way that meant anything to me. I was used to dealing with enterprise risk, but cyber was still very technical, still very, ones and zeros, things I didn't understand, things I didn't, it was like network configuration. Might as well having build an architecture of a network. It'd be the same kind of conversation.
Yeah,
Um, However, today, in looking back and really realizing what companies are having to deal with, not just our customers, but where I was previously, is that when you're dealing with a Fortune 100 company, which they are, and that Fortune 100 company is a publicly traded company, they now fall under SEC rules.
yeah,
Part of the SEC rules is understanding your third-party risk management and, utilizing the things that I know today and things like the Unity Risk Indicator that bring together all of the risk of the organization from a compliance standpoint, governance compliance standpoint, benchmarked against regulations or frameworks that we choose to comply with, and the technical tools and the telemetry feeding out from those, what our risk posture looks like, and sort of blending them all together to give me an insight. The strategic, the quarterly strategic business conversations I would have with our customers would be entirely different today.
Mhm,
I would lead with this.
mhm.
I would lead with what our security posture looks like so that they were confident that we as an organization delivering product to them, we're going to be there not just this quarter, but next quarter and 2 quarters from now. Because one, we are addressing risk in a timely manner. We do understand what our risk looks like, and we are working to improve ourselves to be a better vendor to them in the long run. It's
And,
now it's a cost justification to them. I'm helping them justify what they're paying to me as a vendor.
it ties in. This is perfect. That goes back into audit. The last takeaway point: audit your software, access and alert. Now,
Right.
and I'm going to put it into a perspective which you involve with one of our case in manufacturers,
Yep.
right? So this manufacturer come to us thinking this is a cybersecurity issue, but it was not. It was
No.
much deeper than IT and cybersecurity.
Yep.
Share that experience now that you got out from your dying industry, what I call, into something that is so so much ahead into technology, bleeding edge, and also compliance. It's pressuring from every angle, and we broke it down into 4 level together, from global, regional, local, and to industrial GRC issues, compliance requirements. These 4 levels, how does that apply to our recent customers in the manufacturing sector? Share this story with our friends here.
Yes, they became part of an information security questionnaire from one of their customers, the third party risk management
Potential customers,
potential customer.
which
So
they spent 18 months to try to address.
their potential customer was under obligations to understand their third party risk. So they sent a questionnaire out to our customer. And
And what's related to CMMC for the audience who
correct.
doesn't know is
That's the
cybersecurity. Yeah, go ahead.
cybersecurity maturity certification for the Department of Defense. All vendors to the DoD are required to have some level of CMMC, 1, 2, or 3, depending upon the size of the organization and the data that they control, have a certification for CMMC to maintain their status as a vendor to the DoD. And this is not just the big primes, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, it's all of the vendors down the chain, ninth, 10th party, nth party vendors to these large organizations to a contract if they touch it. So this potential customer sends out the questionnaire to this potential vendor of theirs, and they came to us saying, "Hey, we've spent 18 months looking over this thing, trying to answer all the questions and close all the gaps that our potential customer says that we have. Can you help us?" And so we did. We jumped in and we helped them. But they thought it was a purely technical issue. They thought it was just a cybersecurity issue, but it wasn't. It was much larger. It was an information security and governance program that they failed to have in place. They the leadership of the organization failed to understand that they needed something like this in their manufacturing space. And they did not realize, although they eventually realized, the COO did, that having an information security program in place that dealt with policies and procedures that involved HR, operations, data compliance, and legal. All those departments singing together the same tune, the same policies, and the same enforcement for IT, then to deploy the right kind of software to measure and monitor the effectiveness of their internal governance program, that all of this could be a competitive advantage to them to win this potential customer, to win other potential customers, because they could turn around, just like I said, the quarterly business reviews would be different. Their sales team would have the ability to say, here's what we do. Here's
It
what we
affect the bottom
manufacture.
line directly,
Here's
right?
how we control our operations. Here's how we control our environment. Here's how we make sure your information, your data that you share with us is secure and safe.
And the interesting part, besides that, it was directly impacting their sales, which is the top line,
Correct.
and which is also the interesting part that they realized, the upper management realized that, you know what, we need to get the HR team involved. That was an interesting turnout.
That was,
Be- yeah, because it go back into our first, one of the point we talked about, security awareness educations, right? And they
Mhm.
realize, oh my goodness, that there many of their manufacturers, even the people that whoever gets an email account within that organization, doesn't matter what role they are in, that could be a potential risk. And then the director of HR, actually the one that realized this is a much bigger issue than just getting the top line fulfilled. Because if they don't do all of that, their customer, their potential customer, is not going to do business with them, because they have to comply into all the ISO. I still remember the ISO and the
Mhm.
NIST CSF aggregated framework that they have to address. And that's why the IT team in 18 months, they could not execute it. And I still remember the first conversation within half an hour, how much work that you have done. Oh, I think we have done 70% of it. But by
Yeah.
the time that we're looking into the system data, they could only address about 26% of those 64 compliance items that was demanded by their potential customer. And
Right. It
at
was
the end, I was
conversations you
proud because the end customer, their customer,
yeah.
sent us an email and to thank us to getting it on within 6 months of time, that we were able to complete what they could not do in 18 months.
Yep. But it was a big lift to try to get the organization, to try to get the executives to understand that it wasn't a conversation we needed to have with IT. We needed to have a conversation with all the other departments in there, and for them to make those people available to us, to engage them, to develop these things and put them into place to get these things closed, required legal, HR. And why HR? You think, why HR? Well, you're developing policies
Yeah,
and procedures. If people don't understand the policy of the company and follow the procedures of the company, there's a stick and carrot. And if there is a consequence to not following the procedures, you have these in your organization already.
right.
If you leave the door open for anybody to come in, that's a violation of access to the facility. What are you
Exactly.
going to do with somebody that leaves the door propped open every single day because they want to go out for a smoke break?
Right.
Well, you're going to have a conversation with them. You're going to write them up. You're going to do something. That's HR. Same thing with information security. There's a policy, there's a procedure. If they don't follow these things, if they don't take their security awareness education program test every month, what's the consequences? What's the penalty? Do they get written up? Do they get spoken to? Could they be terminated? What if they do something that brings the organization down? Could they be terminated for that?
Right. Right.
You're looking at potential attorney general's involvement against your company for certain violations. These could be very costly penalties and fines that your organization could be facing, let alone any civil lawsuits brought by either customers, vendors, citizens that may be affected if their data got out there. Then you've got lawsuit penalties, and you've got attorney costs. You're going to let one employee without repercussions bring your entire company down because you didn't want to enforce the policy and the penalty for not following the policy? It's simple. You do it for everything else.
So let me get, now we're getting into the auditing part of it. And
Yeah.
before we getting the auditing part of it is, let's talk about another element that a lot of people have, businesses in particularly, that they might have overlooked, is the insurance.
Mm.
Now, the insurance, again, the cyber insurance particularly, has changed in 2020 again because of the solar wind hack, and
Right.
we can go back and have another episode talk about that alone. But what happened now is that not just the compliance examiners or the regulators needs to have this evidence, what we refer as compliance evidence.
Right.
Also, the insurance company now, lots of business executive, board of director think, oh, we have insurance just in case anything happened. We could use the insurance to, start our business continuity, disaster recovery process. And it doesn't happen anymore. Now insurance company has to look at, especially in the enterprise area, I'm sure it's going to trickling down into the mid-sized small company eventually, is what are you doing with cyber risk management? What are you
Mhm.
doing with your IT, your vendors, your MSP and solutions? These are the conversation I have with Soho type of business owners, small offices, home offices,
Mm.
a consultant, one consultant that they are helping their customers to manage that. They're, they have to look into this third party risk as well, even as a single person, individual
Right.
organization, but they are obligated into complying into this regulatory third party risk management.
Right.
Now, how are they going to audit? It's like, oh, you know what? I'm going to get my company, I'm a individual MSP, or a small team of 10, 20 people. Oh, we're deploying Microsoft, and we deploying Google for our customers. And we don't need to worry about it. Everything is going to go back to Microsoft and Google, right? Wrong.
Wrong.
Because, again, the cyber insurance company is not going to go after Microsoft or Google. They're going to go after your IT and MSP team before, also they might refuse your insurance as a business entity,
Mhm.
and they might refuse your IT vendor and your MSP because they don't take active or adaptive controls into risk management, into
Right.
this risk management. Oh, just because you're selecting Microsoft is going to come back and say, well, did you apply our SIM tool, Sentinel, or did you apply, all our entire E5 suite?
Right.
Otherwise, we're not going to take this liability. It's your vendor, your MSP's responsibility to make sure that you are in compliance into whatever regulations or your insurance demand with requirement is going to be. So that forces the IT and MSP to come and look at the auditing process. Well, what are the solutions being deployed? And come back to the cost. Is it still effective? Well, I got a 20 people company, 50 people company. Well, can we afford the E5 solution from Microsoft? Well, if we cannot, what can we do? These are the questions that go back into the data analytic approach. How do you audit, your existing solution? You already invest money into it, but
Right.
what are they contributing towards the compliance requirements?
And it's understanding it. So, you touched on the cyber insurance. So when the insurance companies, when you apply for insurance, they give you these questionnaires to fill out. And Stanley, you would kind of dug through them, and we found that one of the companies, if you answer incorrectly on one of the pages, they just stop looking at the document, regardless of
Absolutely.
whatever else you said, regardless of what you've done, what you have in place. If you answer incorrectly on one page, because they want you to have a secure environment, and you could answer whatever you'd like on those documents. And sometimes we've seen it with a customer who gave us an argument about how they were answering on their security questionnaire for the cyber insurance. You can answer whatever you like, but you're attesting that you do to certain things there. And don't think the cyber insurance company is not out there doing an external pen test on your environment to understand if your front doors are open. And don't think they're not doing a dark web scan, which is essentially like
Exactly.
going down to the local flea market to see how many of your stolen items are on sale down at the flea
That's,
market,
that's right.
because they want to know, how secure are you? Do you leave your home open? And are people regularly stealing your stuff? And if they are, do you even know they're stealing your stuff?
Right.
And so the insurance companies are understanding your risk about your environment many times before you even understand your own risk about your environment. And you've just told them that you have a very secure environment, that you have MFA, but it's only on this one particular area, but not on the things that you as an executive touch because it slows you down. That disqualifies you. Or your
And that's
premiums are
part
going
of
to be
the
through the roof.
yeah, and that's part of the compliance evidence we emphasize on, right?
So
And
it goes back to
these
the auditing,
exactly.
the auditing and be able to demonstrate in an audit that you do these things.
And these are the breadcrumbs that is already your organization is already invested money into this.
Hmm.
But these are the breadcrumbs that we gather together and put it into a holistic and unbiased point of view to
Right.
evaluate and to audit for to meeting the operation effectiveness and cost efficiency. Now we're going to wrap up with on this note about one other case that we just did. So we just signed on board with a new customer, not a big organization. And Sean, that you work with them, you went down and actually helped them to convert. And one of the, I want to highlight this challenge is your existing IT and MSP, which is in this case, they know their IT vendor are not doing their job. But meanwhile, they actually, this IT vendor holding them hostage with the data that they already gather because they customized this solution from a third party vendor platform. They did some customization with them and they refuse to turn them over to
Well,
us.
but it started with the lack of understanding from the executive management. They they didn't understand IT. They placed a lot of trust in the MSP, and they didn't really kind of evaluate the risk to the organization. So when the MSP said, "Hey, we can do these things for you. We'll take care of it for you. We'll make it easy for you." Well, that sounds great. If you can make it easy for me for something I don't truly understand exactly how you do your magic, but you're going to take care of it for me and it's only going to cost me this, awesome. Do it. So what they realized is they really kind of weren't getting what they were paying for. And so as they tried to switch and move away from that MSP, they realized the MSP had all of their data, all of their operational software, all the operational data, all their
And the
customer data,
passwords.
and the passwords and the credentials, and locked them out and essentially shut them down for a couple of days before we got involved to really kind of help broker them releasing all this stuff. But it did involve me in a conversation with the president of the other MSP to really kind of resolve this issue for them.
And their lawyers.
Well, yeah. So we were able to uh, have the conversation with the president before the attorneys truly got involved and really started racking up those hours. But the fact that the founder of this company was speaking to an attorney really kind of got the president of the MSP to have a conversation with me. But nevertheless, it did go to an understanding of what you're getting yourselves into. You need to understand the risks in engaging and what those contracts are calling for and what they're obligating you to and what they're providing you. And you don't want to be locked into anybody regardless of what it is, unless it's your cable provider, then you don't have many options in many places. But you need to be aware of what are our risks. What if something happened to the MSP? What if they went under? What was the customer going to do? They'd still
And
be in the same situation.
and I think the bottom line to this is we looking at the entire cyber risk management is where this the solution or the talent or the vendors in the whole organization, where is the value coming from each of the pieces, right?
Right.
And that's where the holistic approach is needs to look at, well, where's the value coming from? Well, we
Right.
can't just say, oh, we adding value onto this XYZ. No, let's use the data to prove that over time. And this is why we wanted to, our audience here, you're listening to us talking about this. Well, try to find that value from each of the tools, starting from the lowest cost, which is security awareness educations with your team, with your staff, and then have this conversation with your IT and MSP providers. They are providing some value, but is that value
And that's
able to
internal. That's
justify?
internal IT as well as external
Internal,
IT,
yeah,
whichever way you
absolutely.
have them.
Whichever you have them, yeah, exactly. And then identify the value, and then looking from a value proposition perspective, and again, the holisticness, and you can make that determination from a risk appetite perspective. And you might be very happy with the providing, which is wonderful. They are providing the value for you after your audit, after your evaluation, and then you determine based on my risk appetite and the budget, we're happy with the existing team. Wonderful. That's the best news
Yep.
because you are getting return on your investment. That's the bottom line.
When we do the third party assessments for people, the first thing we'd want to do is to give the team a pat on the back, to let the executive know your investments into your internal staff, your external staff, they're doing the right things. Your investment's good. You're getting a good return on your investment. We'd love to be able to say that. Unfortunately, we don't get to say that very often.
Well, but we don't want to say that either. We just want to say we want to prove it with the data, right? And it's just
We
like
do.
going back
We
into
let the
our
numbers talk.
manufacturing. Yeah, we would, just go back into the manufacturing customer. IT, you did a wonderful job. You did 70%, fantastic. Now let's dive down into it, and then this is where that the baseline assessment comes in. How do you
Yeah.
measure the performance, and so on and so forth. I think that we're running out of time. We don't want to, I think that we have put this foundation of what is cyber risk into this conversation already,
Yeah.
that is going beyond IT, because a lot of companies are not in technology, so they need to, and I hope that our audience listening to this podcast get the value, get the key takeaway. How do we looking at cyber risk management, and bring this conversation into your internal team, into your internal discussions with the board of director and your stakeholders, in your team.
Yeah, use it to facilitate that conversation. It's a way to engage everybody that's relevant in your organization to speak the same conversation and have the same objectives from a business perspective. So I thank everybody for listening
Thanks,
today.
everybody. All right,
If you
we'll
want to know
chat
more
next
about Stanley,
time.
you can find him on LinkedIn. If you want to know more about me, Sean Mahoney, you can find me on LinkedIn.
And
You
I think
find
the most important part is go into LinkedIn, search for cyber risk governance. 3 words: cyber risk governance. This is the group that we put together and sharing our insight, and we will be putting together more. We talked about business impact analysis playbook. We'll dive deeper into that in the
Yep.
future, but look for it.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, bye.